Hello, AP Microeconomics, and welcome back to another lesson on Module 50, Efficiency and Dead Weight, with an emphasis on taxes and international trade. So that's what we're going to build on today. From previous Module 49, we talked about consumer surplus and producer surplus and the idea of being efficient. So if we remember, we talked about the ideas of we talked about the ideas of consumer and producer surplus, this being consumer surplus and then producer surplus down here. And then we said total surplus is producer surplus plus consumer surplus. And essentially, the more surplus we have, that means that more consumers have additional money to spend in the market, um, or to save to help the economy grow. Same with the producers. The additional producer surplus they have is additional profit that they could choose to reinvest into the firm, spend it, or save it. Once again, those are the things that we're looking to do. We would like to see the idea that if we have consumer and producer surplus, we would like to see the demand curve either shift right or the supply curve shifting right. That would cause our equilibrium quantity to go to the right, which would mean an increase in our standard of living. Okay. And that would mean a bigger surplus. But if the demand curve shifts left or the supply curve shifts left, then that means that we see less of a product being sold in the market, and that's not so good for the economy. Now, granted, if the product is like something that is polluting or dangerous or like smoking, something that is bad for society, then obviously we would want less of it. But if it's something like innovations or technology or computers, we would like to see more people have more of those things. So today we're going to discuss total surplus, and we're going to look at the effects of of taxes and how that will create a dead weight. We'll also explain how the different world prices affect consumer and producer surplus, and explain how imports and exports affect our total surplus and our dead weight. So that's what we'll look at today. So if we take a look, are price controls good or bad? Okay, and when we think about the basic idea of our price controls, we think about efficiency being at equilibrium. We like to be at equilibrium. We think of ourselves being efficient when demand equals supply and we're at equilibrium. That is the goal, to be at equilibrium. But we know sometimes the government will put in price floors, price ceilings, and even quotas that will affect the equilibrium. And sometimes we will put in a floor to make sure to kind of protect the producer, or we put a ceiling in to protect the consumers. And then quotas might be overall to get the less of the product in our society. So if we think of our basic economy, here is a consumer surplus, here is the producer surplus. This is our total surplus. Remember, consumer surplus is our willingness and ability to buy a product minus the actual price. And producer surplus is the actual price minus our willingness and ability to buy the product. And once again, the more consumer and producer surplus we have, obviously we're making consumers and producers happier. Now, what happens if the government comes in and puts in a price ceiling saying that we can't produce any more, or we can't sell the price anything above this ceiling? So now the consumer and the producer, they used to be at equilibrium, which was at voluntary trade, but now the government says, hey, the price can't go above this ceiling, so it's going to drive the price down. And by driving that price down, that benefits the consumer. But we see that it changes things. When we see the price driven down to this selling price of the ceiling, we see that as a whole, producers are going to produce less because they have less incentive to produce more at a lower price. So now we see the consumer surplus grows in the sense that the price falls, but they're losing this consumer surplus that they had over here. okay, by that blank white area here. And then we see the producer surplus down here, and producers are losing out. And we can see here we will get dead weight. And we've talked about this in the past, back in Unit 2. So we end up having dead weight loss, loss of consumer and producer surplus. We're worse off as a society. But once again, if this is done to protect the consumer, to keep the prices lower, it's inefficient. When something is inefficient, whenever we have dead weight loss, all right, it's inefficient, and we can say that it has a market failure whenever we have dead weight loss. We also saw that if we had price floors. So example here, if we had a price floor that wouldn't let the prices fall below this floor set price, and we could see here consumers at the higher price are only willing to buy so many goods. So once again, we will see the consumers are affected here, and the producers. We see the producer surplus, and once again, we still have dead weight. And once again, this is just review from things from Unit 2. Once again, we have that dead weight. It's inefficient. It's a market failure. Now, we like to see a total surplus. We like the idea of a growing total surplus. The total surplus generated in the market is a total net gain to consumers and producers from this voluntary trade of a product. Consumer surplus and producer surplus helps us understand the market and how we can be efficient when are producing at when supply equals demand. This is the efficiency spot of a perfectly competitive market. So here we see an example of what we're looking at, the consumer and producer surplus. Once again, we could see here if we were to calculate it, it would be 1/2 base times height. Oops, 1/2 base times height. So we would take the distance from here to here as the height, and the distance from here to here as the base to calculate our consumer surplus. And then again, doing this down here for our producer surplus. But once again, when we're at equilibrium, where we're at demand equals supply, we are efficient. Now, once again, the previous graph shows both consumers and producers are better off because the market is good. They're this voluntary exchange. They're both they're self-sufficient, and people who want it are able to buy it at that equilibrium price. It's efficient. Now, we're at the maximum total surplus that can be achieved at that market. And we're allocating all our scarce resources at the highest possible level. We're getting the most we can from the product. It is the most efficient form of economic system there is. But yet, we also know that when we think about an efficient market, we want to reallocate our consumption among consumers. Like, let's say we wanted to take that demand curve and kind of reallocate the products amongst other people on the demand curve, the people that maybe couldn't afford to buy it at the higher price. And so we're talking about a little bit more of like a socialist idea, and we see that this will be a lack of efficiency. And if we did the same thing with reallocating sales among sellers, those who couldn't quite afford to sell it at a certain price with those who could, and if we reallocate these things, we will see that there'll be a loss of consumer and producer surplus if we reallocate these products in an inefficient manner. So if we take a look here, if obviously point E is the most efficient spot, right? But let's say we're at point A and we're selling books, okay? We're selling books here. And let's say at point A, Anna, because that's who it says here, Anna is willing to pay $35 for a book. And Bob at point B is willing to pay only 25. Now, typically we would say at equilibrium, Bob is kind of out of luck because he's not willing to spend at least $30 for the book, but we know Anna's willing to spend more. So at the market equilibrium, price is 30. Anna purchased a book, but Bob does not. If we rearrange the consumption by taking a book from Anna and giving it to Bob, consumer surplus declines by $10. So if we turn around and we say, hey, we're going to drop this down to $25 and we're going to give that book to Bob. So then we would see the consumer surplus would decline by $10. As a result, the total surplus would decline by $10, and the market equilibrium generates the high. We want the market equilibrium to generate the highest possible consumer surplus by consuming that those who consume the goods are getting the most value for it. Okay, and so essentially uh, Anna is losing that consumer surplus. Now, when it was at $30, she was getting a consumer surplus of $5. Now she's giving it at a lower price to try to benefit Bob. And once again, we're losing the consumer surplus for that. If we look at sellers, if we look at sellers of books, here we have uh, Yvonne is selling a book, and so is Xavier selling a book. Yvonne's selling it at Y, and Xavier's selling it at X. At point Y, we see that the cost is essentially $35. She's willing to sell the book at $35, $10 more than what Xavier's willing to sell it at. At the equilibrium price, we see it's at 30. That's the most efficient spot again. Is if Xavier sells a book, but Yvonne doesn't, we could see, it's helping Xavier because he's going to have $5 of producer surplus, an additional $5. But if we rearrange the sales by preventing Xavier from selling his book and compelling Yvonne to sell hers, producer surplus will also then decline by $10. The market price, once again, we are not at equilibrium, and we're forcing people to sell at prices that don't benefit them. Therefore, we see that loss of producer surplus. So we want to have this voluntary exchange, not a forced exchange. We don't want to force people to sell, and we don't want to force people to buy. So if we take a look here, once again, we could see that we'll see a loss of total surplus here if Xavier at point X were prevented from selling his book to someone like Anna at point A, okay, then we could see the total surplus fall by $10, which is the difference between what Anna's willing to pay here and what Xavier is willing to sell at. We're losing that $10. Okay, so the total surplus would fall by 10, the difference between Anna's willingness to pay and Xavier's willingness to sell. This means the total surplus would fall because of that. And we would see that we would be less than 1,000 books, all right, at the equilibrium. But yet, if we turn around and we look at this other side here, if we look at the other side, if Yvonne at point Y is compelled to sell her book to someone like Bob at point B, the total surplus would also fall by $10 because the difference of what Yvonne's willing to sell, she's willing to sell at 35, right? And Bob is willing to buy at 25. So we see once again the total surplus would fall again here because we're forcing people to buy and sell at and not a voluntary rate. So once again, we don't want that to happen. We want to be at point E with where we are maximizing our total surplus. So essentially, we want efficiency. We want to be at equilibrium. That's the goal, to be at equilibrium, right? That's where we want to be. When we think about the efficiency of the market, we are trying to allocate consumption of the good to the potential buyers who get the most value out of it and the highest that they're willing to pay. And we also want to allocate the sales for the potential sellers at their highest price. So when we put equilibrium together, it's this voluntary exchange where we are practicing efficiency, the idea of efficiency. And that's the goal, to have efficiency. Okay. Now, the problem is we have this problem of efficiency versus equity. all of us understand that we all will pay taxes, right? We've all come to the conclusion that we're all going to pay taxes, whether it's state taxes, federal taxes, excise tax, death tax, inheritance tax, taxes. You could say a tax could be on gasoline. Like there's just taxes everywhere. It's not efficient. There is that trade off up here. We have this trade off between equity and efficiency. If we want efficiency, we're going to be at equilibrium all the time. But if we want to talk about equity or equality, we're going to see taxes. And what happens is with this idea of taxes is that we're going to tax people to offset and for the government to have money to supply things that maybe other people couldn't quite afford, whether it be some sort of social welfare or even like we could argue it's not really wouldn't say it's social welfare, but the idea of the firemen, the policemen, schools, the roads being maintained, snow plows, things like that. We understand we have to pay a certain amount of taxes, but we also want to try to be as efficient as possible with our taxes. Now, there's three basic ideas of taxes. There's progressive, regressive, and proportional. Now, when we think about progressive taxes, this typically means the more you make, the greater percentage you will pay. So if we were to look at, let's say you made $5, or let's say $500 a week, $1,000 a week, $2,000 a week, and $5,000 a week. Progressive taxes would say that as you made more, you might go from 10% taxes to 20% taxes to 30% taxes to 35% taxes. That would be a progressive tax. The more you make, the larger percentage you pay. Now, a regressive tax would mean that you essentially do the exact opposite. The person that pays or makes the least amount of money pays the highest amount in taxes. So they pay 35 versus 30% here, 25, and maybe a 20 or whatever it is. But we know the more you make, the less percentage you'll pay. So that is the tax that rises in proportion to the. So a regressive tax is essentially as you as you make more, you pay less in percentage. Now, that doesn't mean you're paying less taxes overall, the money that's going to the government, you're just paying a less percentage. Okay. So here, this would be regressive, and the one on the right would here be progressive. Now, proportional is it's a proportion to your income all the time. It's kind of like everyone is paying 25% all the way through. Okay, that everyone's paying the same proportion in taxes. Typically, you see along the party lines, you see Democratic people tend to be in recent years more about progressive taxes. Republicans tend to be more about regressive taxes. You can argue it really just depends on your point of view. For example, there is a tax, you pay a fee every year to get a license plate on your car. Now, the license plate used to be like let's say $100 for that sticker on the back of your car, and then it goes up to let's say $151. Some people will argue that this is some people argue this is a regressive tax. Even though the amount that it went up, they'll say that for poor people, $151 is a greater proportion of their income versus a rich person, which is a much smaller proportion of their income. So once again, it just depends on your point of view and how you're looking at your taxes. Now, we know that there are excise taxes, taxes on goods. Okay, there's taxes on goods. Sales. I live in Cook County. The sales tax is 10%. Okay, on goods. This is essentially the tax that you're going to pay on a product. So, for example, if I know I'm going to buy a car, let's say I was going to buy a truck for $50,000, the sticker might say $50,000, but I know that I'm going to have to pay a 10% sales tax on that. So I know that instantly there's going to be a sales tax of $5,000. So the minimum I'm going to pay for my $50,000 car, minimum I'm going to pay $55,000. All right. So I understand that there's a certain amount of taxes, but that cuts into my purchasing power. For example, if I have $3 to my name and I go to McDonald's, all right, McDonald's, and let's say they have a dollar menu. If there's 10% taxes, can I go in and buy three items from the dollar menu? No, I can't. I can only buy two because of the sales tax, because I'm going to have to pay $2.20 for my McDonald's sandwiches. Even though they're a dollar a piece, and with $3, you would think I could buy three items. I can't. I lose purchasing power because of the sales tax that puts on a product here. So the excise tax drives a wedge. It's very similar to when we talked about quotas. Very similar to the ideas of quotas that we talked about last unit. Now, if we think about taxes in general, if we were to increase taxes on consumers, all right, so we have the demand curve here and the supply curve, and let's say this is a normal good, normal good, and let's say the government increases taxes on me. They're going to take more from my check. Well, then we know my demand curve will shift to the left. But theoretically, if we have no sales tax, I'm still at equilibrium. Okay. But I'm buying less because the government's taking more from me. Or if we look over here, if the government raises taxes on a producer, like they have to pay more taxes to sell their product, then we would see their supply curve shift to the left. But once again, we could see that when the government imposes a tax, it lowers the amount of the product that we're going to be able to buy. And we see here in both cases. But we don't see any dead weight here. We see dead weight loss when we tax a good. Remember that. We'll always see dead weight loss when we tax a good. So if we take a look here, if we take a look at this example right here, let's say in the absence of any kind of taxes, the equilibrium price for a hotel in Pottersville, that's what it says, we're in Pottersville, in a hotel room, if we're at equilibrium, they're able in a year to rent out 10,000 rooms at a equilibrium price of $80. Once again, we are maximizing our total surplus here of consumer surplus and producer surplus. So in the absence of taxes, the equilibrium price of the hotel is $80, and they're renting out 10,000 rooms. Okay. The supply curve shows the quantity supplied at any given price. Uh, and But what happens if we put a tax? Think about if we put a tax on the rooms. Okay. Think about if we were to put it at point B here. Imagine if at point B, at the price of $60 per night, hotel owners are willing to supply only 5,000 rooms, shown by point B. Okay. And the hotel owners are willing to supply the same quantity only at the price if they wanted to be able if there was going to be a tax or something like that, they would push that tax onto the consumer. Okay. So essentially, if the government was going to implement a tax, right, then the producer is going to try to pass that tax on to the consumer. So here, if we take a look, if the government imposes a tax, so let's say the government imposes a tax of $40 per room, was imposed on the hotel owners, it's going to shift their supply curve, okay, from S1 to S2. The equilibrium price of the hotel room rises from that $80 now to the $100 per night per room. And now they're only going to be able to sell 5,000 of those rooms. So essentially, the distance from here to here, this distance right here, would be the size of the tax. If we wanted to sell the 10,000 rooms, we would have to put that $40 fee right here, and the rooms would have to be $120. a night. Okay. So we see that once this tax is put in, it's going to force people to pay more money for the room. So in theory, prior to taxes, consumers were willing to pay 80 for the room, but now the consumer has to pay 100. The producer used to receive 80, now they're only receiving 60 because of this $40 excise tax per room per night. Okay. So this is the excise tax imposed on the owner. Now, if we look at this tax in a different way, if we look at this tax from the perspective of the consumer, it would look something like this. If we put the excise tax is imposed on the hotel guest. So if we turn around and we say we're going to put a $40 room tax imposed on the hotel guests, that would essentially shift the demand curve from D1 to D2. And once again, we would see that the equilibrium price would fall again to here, okay, from $80 to $60. So the equilibrium price of the hotel rooms would fall from $80 to $60 per night, and the quantity of rooms rented would fall again from 10,000 to 5,000. Although in the case of the taxes is officially paid by the consumer, in both cases, the outcomes are essentially the same. The hotel is only going to receive essentially that $60. So essentially, the consumer will end up paying here the $100. So in either way, we see that the consumer is paying more than the original $80. The consumer will pay more, the producer will receive less. So this incidence of taxes, this wedge that is created, is like who's really paying the taxes and where is this wedge or this tax revenue going? So if we take a look here, if we could see a tax wedge put in here, we could see the equilibrium price is at $2. But we can see the demand curve here is very inelastic, where the supply curve is very elastic. And we can see because the demand curve is inelastic, we see the burden of taxes, 95% cents of that tax is going to the consumer to pay, and only 5% of, or I'm sorry, 5 cents of the tax is the burden of the producer because the demand curve is inelastic versus the supply curve being elastic. Whichever curve is more inelastic will burden the greater tax. If we take a look here, here we can see the demand curve is elastic and the supply curve is inelastic. So we can see here this $5 excise tax. We can see that the majority of the tax here is burdened by the producer because their curve is inelastic, where the demand curve is very elastic. So the consumer only burdens a small amount of that tax. So once again, we can look at this example. Equilibrium is at $6. The consumer is only burdening per unit, they're only burdening 50 cents per unit, 50 cents, where the producer is burdening the $4.50. They're burdening $4.50 of that tax. So once again, we look at this idea of taxes and we look at who is burdening the majority of this taxes. Okay, so we'll take a look now at the idea once again, whichever curve, when we look at demand and supply, whichever curve is more inelastic, less than one, steeper, whichever, whether it's the demand curve that's steeper or the supply curve that's steeper, or to be honest, if they were both steep at the same time, that would actually not be a bad thing because we would see a very small amount of dead weight. All right, and we're about to get to the old dead weight now. So if we take a look here again, let's say the consumer paid $80, or the original equilibrium was $80, and we're selling 10,000 rooms. Equilibrium's at point E, that would be awesome. But we know the government is going to implement a tax. They implement a tax, a $40 tax per room. So essentially, in this example here, the consumer used to pay 80, now they pay 100. The consumer does. So they're burdening $20 of the tax. The producer used to receive 80, now they receive 60, so they too are burdening $20 of that tax. And you can see now this green shaded in area is the tax revenue that the government is collecting. So we could take this difference from here to here, which is 40. So we could take to figure out the tax revenue, we would take this difference here and here from 100 to 60 would be $40 times $5,000 or 5,000 the hotel rooms, and we would get uh, uh, the total tax revenue that the government would collect would be this box right here. Okay, the consumer surplus would be this up here. The producer surplus would be this down here. And this point from A, B, E, this would be the dead weight loss. That would be the dead weight loss. So we could calculate all these out. We could say the consumer surplus is equal to 1/2 100 minus or 120 minus 100 would be what would that be 20 times 5,000, and the producer surplus would be the same. It would be 60 minus 40, which is 1/2 20 times 5,000. Okay. So we'd like to be able to understand the general principle here. The revenue collected by the excise tax is equal to the area of the rectangle whose height is the same height as that tax wedge between the supply and demand curve. So it's sort of like the quota rent that we talked about before in Unit 2. So when we see here a fall in the price of a good generates again more consumer surplus, just as if the price increases, we see less consumer surplus. And then when the opposite happens with producer surplus, we know when there is a tax on a good, tax on a good, we're going to see both consumer surplus will fall, producer surplus would fall. We will see an increase in tax revenue, and then we will see a dead weight loss as we've that we haven't seen yet. Talking about taxes, so here we could see that the consumer surplus, and I'll put P1 here and P2 here. Um, prior to taxes, if we have A, B, C, F, I'm going to go ahead and I'll put D and G right here. So prior to taxes, consumer surplus was D, A, and B, and producer surplus was C, F, and G. And then total surplus would be all 6 of those letters. After taxes, after this excise tax is put in, we see that the consumer surplus is only D, producer surplus is only G, the government is collecting is A and C, and then so the total surplus then would be D plus G plus A plus C, because we want to include all that trapezoid looking, because this is total surplus here. This is total surplus here, because we can still account for A and C going to the government. And then our dead weight loss would be B and F. Okay, B and F. So should be able to calculate that. So if we go up here, consumer surplus would be 1/2 algebraically P1 minus PC. This is after taxes times QT. Producer surplus after taxes would be 1/2 PP, minus P2 times Q2, or QT, I'm sorry. The tax revenue, I'll just put TR, tax revenue would be PC minus PP times QT. And the dead weight loss would be um, 1/2 uh, PC minus PP times QE minus QT. That would be producer surplus. Or I'm sorry, it would be the dead weight loss. I'm sorry. So we understand that this idea of taxes, taxing a good creates dead weight loss. Okay, and we see that are the consumers are losing some. They have a burden of taxes, and so they lose to tax revenue. And so we see when there's a tax put on something, the consumer surplus falls, and part of their consumer surplus goes to their tax burden and to dead weight loss. And the same thing happens to producer surplus. They lose some to their tax burden and to dead weight loss. So again, here we could see this triangle. If we put in an excise tax of PC to PP, so this is the price now the consumers are paying, and this is now the price that the producers are receiving. They used to both be at equilibrium. We could see this top triangle here is a dead weight loss by the consumer, and down here, this is the dead weight loss by the producer. All right, this used to be part of consumer surplus, and this used to be part of consumer surplus, this used to be part of producer surplus, but it's lost now because we went from QE to QT. This rectangle right here is the tax revenue the government's collecting. Here is the consumer surplus, and here is the producer surplus after taxes. So once again, we can measure this triangle, and we've been doing it algebraically, but we need to be able to practice it with numbers also. Okay, and we have to understand that there's a certain amount of losses we have to be willing to take. You know, the dead weight loss is the total surplus that is lost as a result of the tax revenue. We also have to understand this administrative cost. All right. The administrative costs of taxes are the resources used by the government to collect taxes and the taxpayers to pay, or to evade it. You know, some try to evade paying taxes. Over and above what is being collected, there's a certain amount of losses that we have to understand that are going to be lost due to taxes. So let's take a look once again at taxes. So we're going to look at some examples here. So we know excise tax is a per unit tax on producers, right? It's not a lump sum tax, right? And it's essentially put on a product, whether it be on cigarettes, on alcohol, on environmentally things that are unenvironmentally sound, and basic sales tax we see on products. So let's take a look here at this one. So right here we see that $3. If we're looking at a pack of cigarettes, $3, and we're selling 100 packets of cigarettes, and we see the government sets a $2 per unit tax. So we're going to put a $2 a unit tax. So now essentially the supply curve shifts upwards because of that tax. So we could essentially say that the $2 tax now is going to cause us to buy less of this product. And you can see whether it's here, if we were going to try to sell the same amount of cigarettes, they're going to have to pay $5 for it. But we know with the higher price, the law of demand tells us that as the price goes up, quantity demand it falls. So that's why when the taxes go up here, we can see the consumer is going to pay more. So we see this new tax, right? This vertical distance between the supply curves is that tax. So if we take a look here, what is the price before taxes? Well, the price is $3. The price the consumer pays after taxes is now $4. Okay, is now $4. So if we take a look here, the green here is the tax revenue. Oops. The green here is the tax revenue, and we can see now the consumers are going to pay $4. The producers are going to receive $2. And we can see right here, this is the dead weight loss because of the tax. The total revenue here would be 4 minus 2 is 2. 2 times 80, we can see the total tax revenue is $160. Is $160 by the government. It's $2 per pack. The burden on the consumer is $1, and the burden on the producer is $1. That comes out to the $2 tax. Here, let's take a look at this one here. This one says, what is the consumer surplus before taxes? Before taxes. So if we were right here, what is the consumer surplus before taxes? Whoa, sorry. The consumer surplus before taxes. We could say for number one, before taxes, we would say the consumer surplus would be A, B, C, and D. For number two, it says the producer surplus before taxes would be, what would that be? H, F, E, and G. Number three says consumer surplus after taxes. That would just be A. Number four says producer's surplus after taxes. That would just be G. Number five says, what is the tax revenue? Well, the tax revenue would be B, C, H, and F. And then the dead weight loss by society for six would be D and E. Then seven says, what is the amount of tax revenue that producers pay? What producers pay? And that would be P2 minus P1. That would be what the producers pay. Now, if we go right up here, remember we both the consumers when demand equals supply, that was at P2. So P2 is what the demand, what consumers were paying, and P2 is what suppliers were receiving. After taxes, the consumer on the demand curve is paying P3 and the producers are receiving P1. And that difference, that P3 minus P1, that difference right here is the taxes per unit. But if we wanted to know what is the total taxes, it would be P3 minus P1 times Q1 would be the total tax revenue. All right, the burden of the consumer would be P3 minus P2, and the burden on the producer would be P2 minus P1. That's a burden per unit, Let's take a look at this one here. This is from 2012. This one says, what is the price paid by consumers and the net price received by producers after taxes are paid? So what is the price that the consumers are paying? So if we take a look, we were here, right? We were here. We were at $10. Now, where are we at? Well, now the consumers are paying right here at $10.45. And what are the producers receiving? They're receiving $9.45. So how much is this tax? This tax is $1. So that should have been D for you. The answer should have been D. This one, according to the diagram, what is the dollar amount of the unit of tax? I just gave you that, I'm sorry. That would be $1 because it would be the distance from here to here. Okay, the distance from here to here, which is $1. And we could see that on this one, the consumer is burdening 45 cents and the producer is burdening, 55 cents. Let's take a look at this one here. This one says the graph above shows the market for good X. The letters in the graph denoted the enclosed area. If the government imposes an excise tax of T, which is from here to here, which we could say is from here to here, because the two lines are parallel. Which of the following represents consumer surplus, producer surplus, and deadweight loss after the taxes are imposed. Now, pre-taxes, pre-taxes, consumer surplus is A, B, C, and D. Producer surplus is H, F, E, and G. That's pre-taxes. Now they're asking about post-taxes. So post-taxes, consumer surplus would now just we're here, right? This is where we're at. This is what the consumers are paying. They're paying P3. So their consumer surplus would just be A. The producers are receiving this. So the producer surplus is just G, and the dead weight loss is this area right here, all right, which is D and E. So the tax revenue that the government is collecting is B, C, H, and F. So the answer should be A. Consumer surplus is A, producer surplus is G, and the dead weight loss is D and E. Suppose the market supply curve for shoes is upward sloping and the market demand curve is downward sloping. How will the imposition of a sales tax on shoes affect consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus? We know when there's a tax, both consumer and producer surplus will decrease. Therefore, what are we going to get? Total surplus is going to decrease because there's going to be a dead weight loss. So let's take a look at this one right here. Let's take a look at this one right here. Now we have numbers. Okay. Now we have numbers. So the first thing says the tax per unit. The tax per unit. Well, the tax per unit in this example right here is it was originally equilibrium was at $12 and 12 units. Now the tax here, we have the supply curve with the taxes, it shifts us to the left here. So now the price that the consumers pay is 14, the price the producers receive is 11, so the tax per unit is $3. Okay, then it says what is the total tax revenue? Well, $3 times 10, that's $30. The amount of tax paid by the consumer. Well, the amount that the consumer pays is $2. Excuse me. 14 minus 12 is $2. What is the amount that of taxes that the producer that is paid by the producer? $12 minus 11 is $1. And then it says here the total expenditures. Well, it would be 14 times total expenditures would be 14. That means total revenue. Total expenditures is total revenue. So that'd be 14 minus 10, which would be 140. And then the total revenue for the firms would be that 11 times 10, because that's what they're receiving, and that would be $110. So that means that $30 went to the government, which we had already calculated above. So there is a tax revenue. That's the amount that the government will, or that the consumer is in charge of the taxes. This green is what the producers are in charge of. The total that the producers will keep is in the red there, all right? So we can see once again, this purple and green is the tax revenue, and the dead weight loss would be this right here. This would be the dead weight loss. Let's take a look at this one here. Consumer surplus, consumer surplus before taxes. Let me get my pen over here. That would be consumer surplus before. That would put us right here. So if you want to pause it and take a look, consumer surplus here would be 8 minus 3, which is, or 8 minus 5 is 3. 3 times 90 is 270, and 1/2 of 270 is 135, right? I think, I forget, did we have, I don't remember if we had these numbers all. No, we didn't have these numbers. I thought the numbers were in there. So consumer surplus before taxes is this area here. Oops, right here. The area of that, which is 135. Total expenditures before taxes would be 5 times 90, which would be 450. 450, right? 5 times 90 is 450. The tax per unit here would be $2, right? 6 minus 4 is 2. The total tax revenue that it goes to the government, $2 times 60, that would be 120. The amount of tax paid by the consumers. Well, the amount that the consumers pay is this box right here, which would be $1 times 60 would be 60. The amount of tax paid by the producers would be 5 minus 4 is 1, and that would be this area here. So again, that would be 60. Total expenditures after taxes, now it would be 6 times 60, which is 360. The total revenue for firms after taxes, um, total revenue that the firms received after taxes would be 4 times 60, which would be 240. The consumer surplus after taxes would be just this triangle right here, which would be 8 minus 6 is 2. 2 times 60 is 120. Half of 120 is 60. And the dead weight loss would be this area right here, which would be 6 minus 4 is 2. 2 times the difference here, which is 30. 2 times 30 is 60. One half of that would be 30. So our dead weight loss would be 30. So once again, we could see that firms are receiving less, consumers are paying more. It's we see this dead weight loss of $30 that's lost in society. So there is the total taxes, there's the total revenue. This is what the green is what the producers will receive. So it's sort of like, we're getting screwed here sometimes depending upon where the taxes are. So once again, if we look at this example here, demand curve is inelastic, supply is unit elastic. Who do you think is going to pay the greatest portion of the taxes? If we were to put in taxes here, we could see that the consumers here pay the greatest burden of taxes, because we can see here the equilibrium price of $5, and we can see there's a greater amount that the consumers burden a greater portion of the taxes here because their demand curve is more inelastic than the supply curve. Okay, so so we can see the amount the consumers pay versus the amount the producers pay. And then in the gray there, we see dead weight. What about this one? We can see the demand curve is more elastic and the supply curve is unit elastic. Who is going to pay a greater burden? Well, here we go. The consumers and producers, we can see that this is the total tax revenue here in the yellow. The consumers are in charge of what's in the red. Producers are in charge of what's in the green. Therefore, the producers are paying a greater burden of the tax. And once again, there's the dead weight in gray. So let's take a look at this one here. So now if we take a look here, the tax per unit. What is the tax per unit? We can see here the tax per unit is $3. We could see we could go vertical. We could go vertical right here, straight up here. But we know that people are going to buy less, so that's why we're moving this way towards 20. So we can say that the tax burden per unit is $3. The total taxes will be 3 times 20, which will be $60. There's a consumer surplus after taxes, right? There is the revenue that the producers will be receiving. So essentially, the tax per unit was $3. The total tax revenue was 60. The taxes paid by consumers were 40. The taxes paid by the producers were 20. The total spending was 140, and the revenue to the businesses was $80. So we can see it all again here. So once again, depending upon the elasticity of the curves, we can see who is paying or burdening the majority of the taxes. So once again, depending upon the demand curve versus the supply curve of elasticity, we could see who is burdening the majority of taxes. So if the demand curve is perfectly inelastic, the burden is all on the consumer. If the uh, demand curve is perfectly elastic, the burden is all on the supplier. If they're both perfectly unit elastic, we see the burden will be equal. If the demand curve is inelastic and the supply curve is unit elastic, we know the burden is to the consumer. And then over here, we can see that if the demand curve is more elastic than the supply curve, the burden is on the producer. So that's kind of how we figure out who pays more for taxes. We look at the elasticity of the demand curve and the supply curve. If the supply curve is less elastic than the demand curve, we can see who burdens the most, right? So that's kind of what we're doing here. So if we take a look here, if the supply is less elastic than the demand curve, then the producer burdens more. If the demand curve is less inelastic than the supply curve, then the producers still pay. So it's about wording. Supply is perfectly elastic, right? And the demand curve is perfectly inelastic. The consumers pay it all. If the supply is perfectly inelastic and the demand curve is relatively elastic, the producers burden it. And the last one, if the demand curve is perfectly inelastic and the supply curve is relatively inelastic, the consumers once again burden it all. So we'd like to think about how we figure out taxes. And the thing is, the government tries to figure out what should we tax. And typically, um, the elasticity, if we can find things that are more inelastic to tax, we tend to see products that are more inelastic being taxed because there's less of a dead weight. There's less of a dead weight. So when we think here, um, you know, when we think of gasoline, gasoline is very inelastic. There'll be a high tax on that. So therefore, people will still buy it. So there'll be less dead weight. Here is an example, a practice example here to go through. And this one here has the answers. The answers on the next couple slides here. It says here, assume that gasoline is sold in a competitive market in which demand is relatively inelastic and supply is relatively elastic. Draw a correctly labeled graph of gasoline on your graph and show the equilibrium price. So if you want to pause this and try to answer these and graph them, okay, the answers are on the following pages. So pause, try this on your own, and see how you do. So, what should have happened, okay, is you should have drawn a demand curve relatively inelastic, a supply curve relatively elastic, and we show the taxes here. And you were supposed to label each thing here, the equilibrium here and here. So these are the what you should have drawn here for your points. And then the next page here is the last part, C and D, what you should have put here for C and D. All right, so your answers are here and in your notes, so try those out. So we've talked about several things of inefficiencies. We said, what if there is a price floor, right? If there is a price floor, remember, if we have a price floor, all right, and then we have a binding ceiling and we have a quota, and then we have a tax here, supply plus tax. Let's use a different color here. Let me get a different color here. Because I'm going to do all the consumer surplus, I'll do green. So here, this would be consumer surplus. This would be all consumer surplus here. Consumer surplus would be right here. A quota, the consumer surplus would be here. That would be consumer surplus. And let's pick another color for producer surplus. So the purple would be producer surplus. Then let's go ahead and I'll shade in dead weight. Dead weight, I'll shade that in black here, 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 and here. And then I'll use a yellow here, or I'll use orange. So here, this is the quota rent. So this is going to the government right here. This is the quota rent, right? Here is the tax revenue going to the government here. But in all four cases, all four of these cases, you see the government gets involved in the economy. And what do we see in all these? In every one of them, we see dead weight loss. Every one of them are inefficient. These are all examples of market failure. They're all examples of market failure. Okay, because we have dead weight in all three of these. So if we have a binding floor, binding ceiling, an effective quota, and then a tax on a good, in all three examples, we see dead weight loss, which means it's loss of total surplus. But what about international trade? What about international trade? We're going to take a look at international trade now. Okay, this is the last thing we'll talk about here. International trade. We're going to look at how consumer and producer surplus are affected by world prices versus domestic price. Okay, so we have to remember when we talk about international trade, we have to look at comparative advantage. We have to look at, does a country have comparative advantage? Remember, a country that has a comparative advantage, their opportunity costs are less than another country's, therefore the costs will be lower, essentially less of an opportunity cost, and so the price, typically the product's price is cheaper. So if we take a look here, if we were practicing isolationism, then our domestic price would be at $5. I'm going to put DP here. Domestic price would be at $5. That means domestically, we're going to produce 10 items at $5. Our consumer surplus would be this area up here. Consumer surplus would be here. Producer surplus would be here. This is our domestic price, our domestic market. We're practicing isolationism. We don't like the rest of the world. We're closing off our markets. But what happens if we find out that the world price is at $2? What if we find out that the world price is at $2? Okay. Well, if we open up our markets at a price of $2, at the world price being $2, that would make consumers much happier. They would like to buy at $2. But producers don't like that. Producers don't like that at all. Okay. So here is consumer surplus, right? Here is producer surplus. But if we said that the government turned around and said, hey, the world price is at $2 and we open up our trade, well, now remember the law, what producer surplus is our willingness and ability, or I'm sorry, the market price minus the willingness and ability to buy. Well, now look at where producer surplus is. It's way down here. But now look at the consumer surplus. Look at, we're willing to demand so much more at $2, but we're only supplying domestically 7. So we demand 13, but we're only supplying 7. Now we were at 10 before. So what just happened? Because we're importing goods, we're actually going to see people are going to lose their jobs. Domestic manufacturing will lose their job. Okay. Now, is our society better off? Absolutely. We're better off, even though people lost jobs, our total surplus is better by this triangle right here. By this triangle right here, our society is better off. Our total surplus is increased by this triangle right here. We're better off because of that triangle. But our government wants to protect domestic manufacturing, so they're going to put a tariff on it. They're going to put a tariff. So what they'll do is they'll put a tariff, and remember the world price was $2, right? The world price was $2, but now our government puts a $2 tariff on it. So they're going to put a $2 tariff. So now this $2 is added to the world price. So the world price plus the $2 tariff now makes the world price $4. So now, are we still better off by this little bit? Absolutely. But guess what? Our government is collecting this amount in tariffs because now we're going to only import two products. Now, remember, we were at 10. Then when we went to seven or we went to $2, we were only producing domestically seven. But now that the government put a tariff on it, now we put some domestic workers back to work, but we raised the price. Now, consumer surplus is still better off at the $4 because of this little triangle right here. The government is collecting this taxes right here. We can calculate that by 4 minus 2 is 2 times the two products we're importing here. So the tariff would be 4. What is this area in gray here and here? You got it. It's dead weight loss. This is dead weight loss. All right. We have dead weight loss in those two little triangles. So that's the amount we're going to import. Okay. But we're still better off because the government, in this example, the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus plus the tariffs is going to make us better off. Our total surplus is still higher, though we still have dead weight loss. I don't know why that line does that. I don't know. I'm sorry. So, what if the world price is higher than what if the world price is higher? Okay, so right now we can see consumer surplus is here, producer surplus is here, but what if the world price is at $8 and we decide to open up our markets at $8? Well, there's the $8, right? Now look at the consumer surplus is a much higher price. But now look at the producer surplus. Our society is better off by this triangle right here. Okay. And we can see this distance right here to here. Now we have a surplus of goods. We've created a bunch of new jobs. If we take a look and we draw all the way down out here, we are producing more products in our country. We've created jobs, and we're because we're selling goods on the world market. Okay, we've created more jobs, but the consumers are worse off. But overall, our total surplus is better by this area, this triangle right here, this triangle right here. Though it's producer surplus, we're better off as an economy, and we are going to now now we are going to export. Now we're going to export goods here. Okay. So when the world price is greater than the domestic price, we're going to export. When the world price is below or less than domestic price, we import. Gosh, I don't know why that keeps making those lines like that. I don't know. So let's take a look here. Let's look at this graph right here. Identify the following: consumer surplus with no trade, producer surplus with no trade, the amount we import at world price P, the producer surplus if we trade at world price, consumer surplus if we trade at world price, and if government tariffs lead to the world price to be PT. So Let's go through these, and then I'll use a different color here. Let's use red. So for this first one, it says consumer surplus with no trade. Right, so we're that means we're at P1. Consumer surplus, no trade, we're at H. Producer surplus with no trade, we're at I, L, and T. Right, I, L, and T. Amount we import at the world price. Well, now if we go down to the world price, the amount we import is Q5 minus Q1. So Q5 minus Q1, that would be the amount we import. Producer surplus if we trade at the world price. Ooh, that would just be T. That would just be this right here. Consumer surplus if we trade at world price. Wow, that's going to be a lot of letters. That is going to be H, I, J, K, L, M, N, R, and S. Whew, that's a lot. If the government puts a tariff leading to us to go up in price, how much are we going to import then? So now if we go up to this new tariff, now consumer surplus will be this. Producer surplus will be, let's use a different color here. Producer surplus will be this right here. The government revenue will be N and R because we're going to only import Q4 minus Q2. And then what becomes of M and S? M and S are dead weight loss. Are dead weight loss. Here is another free response from 2004. And once again, this one says in the diagram above, show the domestic supply and demand here. If the current world price is of good X is PW, if the current world price does Plasonia export or import? Do they export or import? Well, they're going to import. Why? Well, if we're at this world price, what do we demand domestically? We demand 350 domestically, but we're only supplying 50. So we have a shortage. Therefore, we're going to import that shortage of 300 goods. It says, given your answer in part A, indicate the quantity that would be import or export, which I've done. Then C says, assume that the government of Plasonia imposes a tariff on the good X that takes us from PW to PT. Using the labels in the graph, indicate the changes of the following. What happens to consumer surplus? Well, when we were at PW, when we were at the world price, consumer surplus went from H to N to PW, right? Went all the way from here to here. That was the size. So consumer surplus when we were at PW was H, the triangle of HN and PW. We'll call that right to here. And the producer surplus was just this little, there's no letters here, but I'll shade that in. That was the producer surplus. But now it says, what if we go ahead and we go up to PT? Now, if we're at PT, consumer surplus is now H, all the way down to M, all the way over to PT. That is consumer surplus. And producer surplus would grow by this area right here. It would grow. So now this would be the producer surplus afterwards. Indicate how employment in domestic industry that produces a good X will be affected by this tariff. Well, with this tariff, remember, we were here. I don't know what number that is, but let's say that's 200. When we were at the domestic price at equilibrium, we were at 200. But then when we went down to PW, the world price, we started producing less, so domestic manufacturing jobs left. But because the government put a tariff on it, we went from domestically producing 50 to domestically producing 100, so jobs are back. Jobs are back. And we could see that the tax revenue the government will collect will be this area here. This is the taxes that the government will collect right here, this box. And the dead weight loss will be these areas right here in green. This is the dead weight loss here, and this is the dead weight loss here. Okay. Here is another example. You could try this, and I believe the answers are after this. Um, this is asking you here, identify the following before international trade occurs. The price of oil in this market would be P2 and the quantity sold would be Q2. Now assume that the United States begins to import at PW, right? Now assume that the U.S. begins to import oil. Identify the quantity imported. The quantity imported would be Q3 minus Q1. Then it says here, identify the consumer surplus in the market for the before international trade. Before international trade, um, consumer surplus was this right here, and producer surplus was this right here before international trade. Okay. Then it says after international trade. After international trade, consumer surplus is now this, and producer surplus now after international trade is just this right here. All right. All right. So we basically went over what happens to total surplus because of taxes, and we also went over total surplus um, if we practice international trade. And we can see whenever we tax a good, we have dead weight loss. That we understand that international trade, when we put tariffs on anything, we have dead weight loss. So hopefully this was beneficial. It's pretty long. Until next time, have a great day.